Hey there, just quickly, this video is actually part of a much larger video that I uploaded last week. Be sure to check that out if you want to watch all of it, but I thought I'd make just little versions because I know 4 hours is a bit daunting to some people. So here is the first Doctor's era, and let's get straight into it with Season 1. Season 1, as its name suggests, is the original season. This is where everything started, and in all honesty, as we'll get into, Season 1 definitely feels like the start of the show. There's a lot of experimenting in this season, and some of it works, some of it doesn't. One thing to definitely take into account is, of course, William Hartnell as the first Doctor, and the companions with Ian, Barbara and Susan are honestly a really good team that are fleshed out enough for the year that this was made, and compared to some of the companions down the line, they actually get quite a lot of character development, especially Barbara in this first season. But with all that out of the way, let's get into the actual stories themselves. An Unearthly Child is one of those stories which really encapsulates the first part being better than everything else. The first episode, I would definitely argue, is one of the best pilot episodes for a television show ever made. The other 3 parts of the story are fine to kind of bad at times. So when it comes to episode 1, everything about it is perfect. The way the characters are introduced, the way the Doctor especially is introduced, as well as the TARDIS, and the overall feeling of the story is just perfect. The rest of it is not so great. Episode 2 is decent, but then it very quickly falls into caveman politics with part 3, and by part 4 I've just completely stopped caring about the caveman politics and just want them to move on to the next story. This is a very mixed story, so can't be any higher than a 5 out of 10. The Daleks is definitely iconic. I mean, everything about this story screams perfection to a certain extent. The introduction of the Daleks is one of the best villain introductions in television history. In fact, probably one of the best introductions in all of sci-fi history. And the build-up between the Daleks and the Thals is another great conflict, completely showing stuff like fascism versus stuff like socialism. And it's just shown so perfectly until about episode 5. Episode 5 and 6, mostly known for the fact that the characters had to jump over a gap, really does damage the story, but only for those 2 episodes. The other 5 episodes are absolute masterpieces in tension, horror, science fiction, and even in some elements comedy. And honestly, this is a great story, would highly recommend. And when the colorization shortened version comes out later on today, I'd say definitely check it out. This story is great. The Age of Destruction is a very strange story. Originally, Doctor Who was only commissioned for 13 episodes, and with 4 episodes being given to An Unearthly Child, and the next 7 being given to the Daleks, this story was kind of cobbled together last minute, and honestly, in my opinion, you can't really tell. Everything from the tension, the drama between the characters, especially between the Doctor and Barbara, it is brilliantly written. And it's just really good storytelling done by David Whittaker, someone who, pretty instrumental in the creation of Doctor Who, and with this being his first written story done properly, it's almost faultless until the final 10 minutes. Now, since the story is only a 2-parter, it doesn't drag on like some of the others, but the ending to the story is a little bit rushed, despite having an amazing performance from William Hartnell. I still think, though, this story is great. Really highly recommend it, and since it's just a 2-parter, it goes by super quickly. Marco Polo is a story that is called by many fans an absolute classic. And as much as I agree that it is a classic, it has a lot of faults. But the first one is definitely that it's a 7-part story, when honestly I think this could easily have been moved to a 4 or even 5-parter. Especially towards the second half of the story, it does really start to drag on, with many plot threads just being there to pad the runtime. more than actually feeling like they're necessary for the story to progress. The cast are absolutely incredible as per usual, and a lot of the stuff they were able to achieve at the time is groundbreaking. It's a shame the story is missing, and I wish it was returned to the archive or even animated, but without the full visuals, I do struggle sometimes with this story, and because of it, it leaves me with a very big mixed feeling. So, I'm sorry, big fans of Marco Polo. It's not the greatest in the world, but still quite enjoyable. The Keys of Marinus is definitely the Marmite story of season 1 of Doctor Who. A lot of fans really enjoy it, and a lot of fans really don't. And for me personally, I fall on the really enjoy side. Yes, the story is absolutely mental, with every single episode taking place in a completely different era, different cast, different production team at certain points. But I really enjoy it, and with it being the second story by Terry Nation, who created the Daleks, you can kind of feel that he's flexing his muscles when it comes to his writing talent. I love this story, in all honesty. It's really fun. Each little segment of it feels like its own mini-story, and it works perfectly for me. The only issue I have is honestly the wraparound story in episodes 1 and 6. There's just no real threat from the villains here. It's fine for those parts. But overall, I'd still say it's a great story and would highly recommend, especially for people who've only watched New Who, to go into the classic era. The Aztecs is definitely, in my opinion, the pinnacle of season 1. It's where the storytelling reaches its absolute height and where the supporting cast and the main cast really do the best work in season 1. The Aztecs is a proper historical, the same as Marco Polo from earlier on, but this time I feel like the storytelling has been done much better. With only being a 4-part instead of a 7, it can really focus a lot better on the plot points, as well as the character interactions. With the Doctor and Barbara's interactions in this story being some of my favourites, this story also having some of the best jokes in season 1, with some really good action sequences for the time. And honestly, I love the Aztecs. It's an amazing story that I highly recommend people check out whenever someone says that all historicals are bad. The Sensorites is definitely the first dud of the season for me. I don't hate it outright, but a lot of the storytelling in this one is slow. This story easily, in my opinion, could have been a 3 or even 4-parter. Not much happens. A lot of it is just weird politics for an alien species that aren't fleshed out enough for us to actually care about their politics. And literally, the ending of the story depends on something so stupid, it kind of baffles the mind. I do really enjoy the characters once again. Susan especially finally gets something to do in the first half of this story before being shoved to the sidelines again. And there are some good ideas, but it just doesn't come together in the end, and it feels like both slow and rushed at the same time. Honestly, this is the first story of Doctor Who I'd say is bad, but there can be some so bad it's good enjoyment from it. Last but not least for season 1 is the Reign of Terror, and it is fine. The Reign of Terror is another historical following on from Marco Polo and the Aztecs, and it's fine. I enjoy some parts, but this story really starts to cement the whole Doctor and companions getting captured over and over again trope, which would become a problem later on for Classic Who. The first Doctor doesn't really do much for most of this story until the very end. It's mostly a story about Ian and Barbara and Susan, which is good, because we finally get some full development for them as a little trio. But overall, I think that the storytelling did not need to be 6 parts. This is yet another story in season 1 that would have benefited from being a 4-parter instead. It's not bad by any means. I do enjoy a lot of aspects of it, especially the last episode, which really, really enjoyable. But overall, this is another mixed story, I'm afraid. Season 1 of classic Doctor Who, for me, is quite a mixed bag. There's some incredible stories, such as the Daleks and the Aztecs, but at the same time you also have some dull stories, such as the Reign of Terror, and even an outright bad story with the Sensorites. I feel like Season 1 they were trying to find their footing and didn't really know what to do with the show yet, something which would become a bigger problem throughout the rest of the First Doctor's era, to be honest. I'd still state though that it's worth checking out just to see the origins of the show. And up right now, here are all of my ratings for each of the stories. And if we just shuffle them around a bit, let's change it so now you can see the rankings of each story and where I'd put them personally from best to worst. Like I said, I enjoy Season 1, but it definitely feels like a Season 1 of a show. We're not quite there yet, but do you know what? We got some gems from it in the end, so I don't overly mind. Still, a lot more to come with another 25 seasons, and I'm guessing another 3 hours of this really long video. Sorry about the length again, guys. Just gotta deal with it. Following the rating success of the Daleks, Season 2 of Doctor Who was commissioned rather quickly, in all honesty, and it brought us another 9 new stories this time instead of the previous 8. Now, to be honest, the first story of this season was meant to be part of Season 1, but was pushed back to be part of Season 2's production schedule instead. Even so, there's a lot of changes coming in Season 2, with the entire cast basically being redone, and a lot more exciting changes on the way as well throughout Season 2. So, hey-ho, let's see how well it does when it comes to the actual stories themselves. Since the Giants is a leftover from Season 1, it does have some of the growing pains that Season 1 has, and is one of the very few stories of the black and white era to be a 3-parter instead of the usual 4. This is actually due to the 3rd and 4th episodes being seen as boring, essentially, by the BBC, so they just cut them both down and adapted them into 1 episode instead. Honestly, I think it's a good decision, as the pacing of the Giants is really interesting, even if it's not perfect. The first 2 episodes really do feel much slower than episode 3 of Planet of Giants, and it's still very fun. I had a lot of enjoyment from it. I like the concept of the cast being shrunk down, and it has a little bit of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids vibes over 20 years before that movie was even released. This story is good, it has some problems, and it's definitely very cheesy, but overall, it's a good start to Season 2. Less than a year after their introduction, the Daleks were brought back for Daleks' Invasion of the Earth, which, all honesty, I'm already going to say it outright, this is an amazing story. It's no wonder it is so acclaimed by fans even nowadays. There are some minor issues with the pacing because it is a 6-parter, but the ending really does just justify all those slow moments and makes them feel like they were needed to really expand the characters. This story is honestly, like I said, amazing. It does everything the Daleks does, but brings it to Earth in contemporary times, set like in our time, compared to the 1960s. So modern day contemporary for us, lad. And it's just so cool to see more Daleks. And since this is the first Doctor Who story to have a recurring monster from a previous story, it really does set the benchmark for how iconic certain villains become. Yeah, this story is amazing. It starts off amazing, it ends amazing. A couple of dud moments, but overall, amazing story. Following on from Susan's departure at the end of the Daleks' Invasion of Earth, we have The Rescue to introduce a brand new young female companion to travel with the Doctor, Ian and Barbara. This story is good. It is nothing more than good, but it is definitely nothing less than good. To be honest, there's not much of a story to be told until the final 10 minutes. It is mostly just introducing the audiences to Vicky, and it does a good job at it. Vicky's immediately an endearing character, in my opinion. I enjoy seeing her, I enjoy seeing how bubbly she automatically is with the rest of the cast, and the chemistry between them is perfect from the get-go. It's no wonder that she stuck around for as long as she did. The rest of the story is serviceable at best. Not much overly happens. There's a little plot about a possible genocide, which is pretty damn brutal for 1960s, but overall, this is a good story. Definitely enjoy it, as it's just a quick two-parter. The Romans is another one of those stories which is a bit marmite from people. Some people love it, some people hate it. I actually fall in one of the weird camps of I just like it. I will say it right now, the comedy in this episode is definitely the funniest the show had been at this point, and definitely a sign of things to come with some of the physical comedy of the second Doctor. And all the comedy elements I absolutely adore. I'm not even going to sugarcoat it. My only issue is the rest of the story feels a bit too similar to the Reign of Terror with its structure. Even the way the characters are separated and brought back together, it feels very similar to that previous story, and it does detract from it at certain points. But still, like I said, this story is so damn funny. I wish I could give it a rating higher than a good, but it is a good story, and by just giving it a 7 out of 10, that's not detracting from how absolutely hilarious this story can get at times. The Web Planet is bad. Review over. Okay, I won't actually do that. So this story was actually meant to be a competitor to the Daleks, with the Zarbi apparently being pushed as the new Daleks for merchandise, and I don't understand why. This story is really boring. I feel like even if it was a two-parter, they would have had to have stretched some scenes out to even reach that level of length, and the fact it ended up being a 6-parter is absolutely baffling to me. But the reason why this story is only getting a 3 out of 10 at bad instead of an awful is because at many moments it can be so bad it's good. Like the butterfly people, who I can't even remember the name of because this story is so boring, are really funny at times with how cheesy and how much the actors really go into the cheese factor. It's so bad it's good. But yeah, this is a bad story. Only watch this if you're drunk. The Crusade is a story that I have very mixed feelings on. I absolutely love a lot of the historical stuff, coincidentally, and even though I'm not the biggest fan of historicals, I think it is adapted very well when it comes to the king and his sister wife, according to historians, which is just so cringe, and I'm glad that they didn't actually shy away from that rumour / pretty much proven fact. My issue for this story actually comes from the sci-fi elements with the Doctor and companions. They just don't interact enough with the supporting cast in this story for me to actually care much. It honestly feels like it was originally just a normal BBC drama, which got shoehorned in to be a Doctor Who script instead so people would actually watch it. And that's the feeling throughout the entire story. It feels incomplete and just not very well written at times. But like I said, some of the historical parts I really do enjoy, so it's getting a mixed from me. It's a 5 out of 10. So the Space Museum basically looked at an unearthly child and how great the first episode is and how boring the rest is and said, hold my beer. So the first episode of the Space Museum is genuinely one of the most interesting concepts for a Doctor Who episode ever written, before the next 3 episodes become one of the most bog-standard Doctor Who stories ever made, even with its own little rebellion and the Doctor, helping people to start a rebellion against the bad people being some of the most one-note villains, and the rebels being some of the most one-note heroes. Nothing about the story feels unique after that first episode, and it does completely fall apart. If it was just the first episode on its own, I'd probably honestly rate it a 10 out of 10. It's that good as part 1. The other 3 are so boring though, and so bad at times. They'd all be 3s, so it's another mix for me, another 5 out of 10. The chase is definitely on, and yes, I did use the chase music for the start of this because I thought it was funny. The Chase is another Dalek story, and the second one of this season and third one in total, really starting to show how popular the Daleks were becoming with the British zeitgeist. I'd honestly say that this story is great. I really love the fact that it takes elements from the Daleks and the Keys of Marinus to create almost like a combined story between Terry Nation's other stories he'd written so far for the show. I love all the scenes with Ian and Barbara, with this being their last story, and honestly, Stephen's a very interesting character who's introduced right at the very end. Overall, though, this story is just really fun. We jump in each episode, sometimes twice in the same episode, to different historical, future, and even not real events. And it's just really entertaining, and the Daleks are finally showing some comedy compared to their first two much darker stories. Yeah, this story is great. The Time Meddler is another really good story for this season, finally introducing us to another member of the Doctor's race that's not just the Doctor or Susan, with the Monk. So the Monk is essentially a prototype version of who would end up becoming the Master. Different characters, but with some of the same elements, with some of the same mischievousness and kind of loose comedy parts. This story is also Stephen's first as a companion, and it really does show him in an amazing light right from the start. Stephen ends up becoming the first Doctor's most recurring companion after Ian and Barbara, and with a story like this, you can definitely see why. He's really entertaining throughout, the Monk is really entertaining throughout, the Doctor's incredible throughout, and then Vicky is also there. And that's where, for me, the story kind of falls apart. Vicky doesn't do much in this story without another character being there. And it's really detracting at times with how integral to the plot she was in the previous. And the ending is exceptionally rushed, but it's still a good story and I still highly enjoy it. And that is it for season 2 of Doctor Who. Definitely a bit of an improvement over season 1. Still got its bad story though, as each of the classic series basically has at least one bad story. But yeah, I still really enjoy this season. Definitely a lot more ups and downs this time, even if sometimes it felt a bit dragged on with some stories. And there's definitely a section in the middle of this season which does get a bit annoying after a while. The introduction of Vicky and Stephen as new companions as Susan, Ian and Barbara all leave, all great. And yeah, here is my ratings for each episode. And let's just swivel that around to the rankings for each episode. And yeah, I like this season. It's a lot of fun. It's still not good overall, but definitely a step up from season 1 and showing that the production team is starting to understand what's necessary in order to make the show work. Season 3 of Doctor Who is definitely going to be a tricky one to explain. Essentially, season 3 is where everything started to change. William Hartnell's health started to deteriorate. New production teams were basically brought in every week in order to try and fix the show. We go through 5 female companions or companion stand-ins in this season alone, and yes, I'm just going to tell you straight off the bat, season 3 is a very mixed mess. Still enjoyable at times, but you could feel at certain stories how much the production team was starting to struggle with what was going on behind the scenes, especially when it comes to the Doctor's role in the show, which throughout this season gets more and more reduced as episodes go on. So, with that out of the way, let's get into the episodes themselves. Galaxy 4 is definitely a weird story and one of the weakest season intros in the entire show. I wouldn't say it's the worst so far, I'd say it overall, An Unearthly Child is definitely worse, but Galaxy 4 isn't much better. It's a decent story, but you could really already feel the production issues of this season, and this is just a first story. This is Verity Lambert's last role as producer for any Doctor Who story with the main cast, and it's not the best for her to go out on. There are some elements of this plot which are really interesting. I like the twist, I just wish it wasn't so obvious. I really, really enjoy episodes 3 and 4. I think they're brilliant. But episode 1 is kind of slow. Episode 2, nothing really happens. And like I said, the twist itself is not choreographed well. But the Chumblies are really damn cute. I'd say this is a decent story, but a shame this is Verity Lambert's final Doctor Who story. Mission to the Unknown is another strange one. So this is Verity Lambert's last story overall for Doctor Who, but it doesn't feature any of the main cast and is actually setting up a story in 2 serials' time. And it's just a very strange idea to try and do this. I do like a lot of Mission to the Unknown, even though the story itself is completely missing. Get used to hearing that with this season. But with the remake version that's out on YouTube, I do quite like it. My main problem with Mission to the Unknown is it is just a prologue. There's no real story, it's just setting up the world that the Daleks' master plan takes place in. And without the main cast being there, it's not really an episode of Doctor Who. At least the Dr. Light stories and the companion light stories of the modern era do still have them there in the background. But with Mission to the Unknown, it basically feels like it's starting a spin-off. And not a very good one, to be honest. It's still decent, I still enjoy it, but it's definitely a Doctor Who oddity. The Mythmakers is another story that is completely missing from the BBC archives. Like I said, get really used to hearing that throughout this season. And I was not expecting at all to enjoy it. I'm not the biggest fan of historicals in general, and I wasn't really looking forward to watching another historical that is completely missing like Marco Polo, but I was pleasantly surprised when it came to the Mythmakers. A lot of comedy in this episode does help elevate it for me. I really love how much character development Vicky finally gets after being a companion for a whole year. And Stephen is great throughout the story, as is the First Doctor. My main issues come with the pacing for this story. Episodes 2 and 3 get really, really slow. And the introduction to new companion Katarina happening in episode 4 really showed how much the production team did not care about introducing a new companion. I'd still say this is a good story. I still recommend it if you can find it. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. The Daleks' Master Plan is a 12-part story, which is the equivalent of the entirety of Series 13 of Flux. And honestly, I still really enjoy it. Despite its length, which I was dreading even more than the Mythmakers, I think it pulls it off in a weird way. I do think at times it can get a bit slow, and it could have probably been an 8-parter instead of a 12. Well, technically 11, but let's not get into that. I do think the fact that it becomes a bit like the Keys of Marinus towards the end with each episode in the middle section, jumping between different time periods, different supporting characters, it does help to break the pacing quite a lot. Mavic Chen is also an incredible villain, but this is really starting to show the issues behind the scenes with John Wilds. And the fact that we go through 3 companions in this story, starting with Katarina, and then Brett, and then Sarah. And yeah, it was really starting to show how problems behind the scenes really were starting to come on Donald Tosh and John Wilds, who took over in the previous story. Still a great story overall, still really enjoy it, and still would highly recommend though. The Massacre is another Marmite story of Classic Who, and yes, it's completely missing once again. At least for the Daleks' Master Plan, we did have 3 out of the 12 episodes still existing, but yeah, no visuals this time, can only be done through loose canon or through audio, depending on which one you personally prefer. Now, I like some aspects of the Massacre. I love how dark the story gets, and the monologue scene with the First Doctor at the end of the story is incredible, and it's really nice to see Stephen do stuff on his own. The issues once again come for me with the storytelling this time. It's just not good. It's very slow-paced, it's very boring, and sometimes it feels like they're just trying to be as dark as possible for controversy. This story also once again introduced a new companion with Anne Chaplet, and then just kills her off, at the end of the story, and we get her ancestor as a new companion introduced in the last 5 minutes of part 4. And yeah, the story's a mess. I understand why a lot of people love it, but for me, I find it quite bad. The Ark is definitely a strange story. It's very enjoyable with the way that it splits the story in half from episode 1 and 2 basically being its own story, and episodes 3 and 4 being a sequel to the first story. And I really do like that aspect, and I really do like Dodo as a companion. I know she's not very well liked in the fan base, but honestly, she feels normal to me. It's a shame she lost her northern accent, sort of, for this story because of production team issues, but I really enjoy it. My main issue comes with the second half, and with some of the awkward racial issues going on in the story, of all the protagonists being white characters and all of the villains being black with webbed feet, which was kind of a racist caricature back in the 1940s. A bit awkward. I don't think it was intentional, but it does really take away parts of the story. And overall, the costume design isn't very good. But I'd say overall the story itself is good. It's very fun, it's very cheesy. Very 1960s Doctor Who. The Celestial Toymaker is another Marmite story of the classic era, as is many of them, and once again, missing, unlike the Ark, which was a nice little break. Honestly, I love this story. I think the storytelling elements are a bit weak at times, but the visual aspects, even with the story being missing, is so cool to me. The Toymaker himself is an incredible villain and essentially a god. Like, how much cooler could you get for a Doctor Who villain? I'm very excited to see what Neil Patrick Harris does with the character. I love the set design, despite the fact this show had such a minimal budget for this story. Dodo and Stephen are great in it. The first Doctor, despite not even being in episodes 2 and 3 and was just a disembodied hand, William Hartnell does some of his best performance as the first Doctor. But then in episode 3 they say the N-word. And it makes me very uncomfortable, in all honesty. 2 stories in a row, both done by the same showrunners, that have some racial complications. Very uncomfortable, and I decided not to think too much into it. But I'd still say the story is good despite that. The Gunfighters is another one of the few stories in season 3 that actually has all of its episodes intact, so you can watch them freely. And honestly, I wish it didn't. The Gunfighters is the first story of the entire show that I will call awful. Most of the sets look pretty bad. I understand the budget aspects, but I think the Celestial Toymaker even looks better than this and had a much weirder concept. Stephen does nothing in the final 2 episodes. Dodo is completely sidelined after episode 1, and even the Doctor just feels boring in this story, apart from a couple of, honestly, exceptionally funny moments of acting from William Hartnell, and he does do some great work here. Everything else, though, is terrible. The fact this is a historical but not even slightly accurate, where characters who weren't even there for the battle at the OK Corral are just there. Everything else as well, the song, oh my lord, the song, the Last Chance Saloon song will be stuck in your head for days because they play it about 30 times in the story, and the story is only 90 minutes. No, awful, awful story, and I really hate it. The Savages is honestly a weird story to me. It's another one of the stories in season 3 which is completely missing, and I don't think that helps its place in history. My main problems with this story is that we had this story at the start of this season. It's the same plot twist that was in the start of this exact same season. So if you'd already seen Galaxy Fall, you know what the twist will be. And that's a big problem, in my opinion, with many other issues as well, such as this being Stephen's last story. Despite the fact Stephen doesn't get to do much, really, until the last 2 episodes of the 4 parts, Dodo is once again just there, not doing anything, and even the Doctor doesn't do much in this story. The only reason it's kind of saved is due to the ending with Stephen's departure, as well as the supporting cast, who do a really good job in this story. I'd say the story is pretty forgettable, but it's a good ending for Stephen with the last 5 minutes. Continuing on with the character departures throughout season 3, because wow, they really did just consistently recast the main group. Honestly, the War Machines is great. I'm just going to come out straight away and say it. The plot is broken. There's no way to sugarcoat it. but everything about this story just feels right apart from the story itself. I love Wotan as a villain. He's creepy, he's menacing, he's a complete cyborg, it's disturbing. Ben and Polly are immediately interesting characters to me and some of my favourite Classic Who companions. The First Doctor has some of his best moments in his entire run in this story, where he just stares down a war machine, and even Dodo finally gets to do something for the 2 out of 4 episodes that she's actually in. Yeah, this story is great. It has some issues, but overall this is a really enjoyable story and really started to show what was possible with the show. Something that the Second Doctor's era would really, really take inspiration from. Season 3 to me overall feels like a big step back, even from Season 1 at times. A lot of the stories you can feel the production issues with the constantly changing members of the cast, the constantly changing members of the production team, and yeah, this season is an absolute mess. It is the worst story so far in my opinion, with another story coming pretty close to being the worst story so far, and a lot of mixed or good or decent episodes with only 2 real standouts. The season really is quite disappointing, as you can see from my ratings. We didn't even get a 9 out of 10 this time, and honestly, if the Daleks' Master Plan was reduced to 8 episodes, it'd probably be a 9 or even a 10, but with the way that it ended up, yeah, this season's kind of a mixed bag for me, and if we change it over to my rankings, yeah, it was pretty obvious where certain things were going to go. Don't get me wrong, this season does have its bright spots with the Daleks' Master Plan and the War Machines, but it has so many duds and more mixed/decent stories that it does drag on a little bit too long, and like I said, you could feel the behind-the-scenes issue, some of which will come to an absolute head in just a couple of stories' time. You'll see what I mean. Season 4 started to show a lot of changes for the show itself. Doctor Who had really started to go into a problem, and Season 3's ratings had come to an all-time low. Something drastic and new needed to change, both in front and behind the camera. Honestly, Season 3 is, like I said, not very good, but Season 4 is when I think they really started to hit their stride with the black and white era. And let's start that off straight away with... The Smugglers is not the best intro. In fact, for a season itself, this is the worst starting episode for any Doctor Who season by this point. The Smugglers is a completely serviceable story that gets really boring really quickly. Ben and Polly, despite being just introduced, don't do too much in this, and just mostly stand around and talk to the smugglers / the doctor / whoever else happens to be in the room at the time, without actually showing any kind of character behind them. Polly does get the short end of the straw, especially with this story, as she doesn't do hardly anything without another character helping her, and the Doctor is essentially not in this story. So many scenes of the Doctor being there, William Hartnell's health had really deteriorated, so he just kind of stood around, not really being as authoritative as he was in the War Machines, and not even as interesting as he could be in other stories. This story is bad. I wouldn't say it's the worst, I wouldn't say it's as bad as the Gunfighters, but yeah, overall, bad story, very boring. The 10th Planet is definitely a transition story for Doctor Who, with this being the final story with William Hartnell as the First Doctor, and yeah, you can feel his health deteriorating as the story goes on, as he's not in most of it. Also the introduction of the Cybermen though, as well as the Second Doctor, really showing how the show can rejuvenate itself every few years. I honestly really like this story. Ben and Polly get a lot more to do in this story compared to the previous one. The First Doctor, despite not being in much of it, feels a lot more empowered, like in the War Machines. And yeah, the Cybermen are absolutely terrifying in this. I'm not sure if it's the black and white aspects or just the overall Mondasian Cybermen design, but they are freaky. The first episode especially is terrifying at times, especially with its cliffhanger ending. Episodes 2 and 3 do drag on quite a lot. But episode 4 brings it back full force and is honestly a 10 out of 10 episode on its own, not including the rest of the story, with, First Doctor regenerates. I wonder what happens next. And that's all the First Doctor stories for season 1. Only 2, so honestly makes this very easy. And looking at my rankings, I think it's pretty obvious which one out of the 2 of them wins out, because swapping over to the ratings is literally just flipping the 2 of them. And I have mixed feelings on the start of this season. As you'll see next week, or from my bigger video, I definitely prefer the Troughton parts of this season, but his regeneration is an emotional one, and it's an incredible journey for the show. So I'll see you all next week with Patrick Troughton, or, as I said, there's a big 4-hour version if you'd prefer it. Toodles!